Disclaimer, this video serves as a sequel to the previous Luard documentary which we made a few years ago. If you haven't already watched that, please do, link is in the description. If not, some of the references and jokes might not make sense, and some of the continuity references might not make sense. Either way, please enjoy this feature of the Yellowcard documentary. 2018 is wrapping up. People are finally getting used to the reboot, we lost Stephen Hawking and Avicii, and the two biggest governments in the world continue to be walking disasters. We're still less than halfway to all the clans getting their V-era support, but next up on the block is Team AL4, which can only mean one thing. It's time once again to bust out the eyeliner and crank up my Chem to 11 for more Shadow Paladin support. By this time, Luard has solidified itself as being one of the few G-era decks that can stand up to the 12 to 13k base power and the 10k triggers that V-era brings. While it wasn't as dominant as it was towards the end of G when we left off last time, it was still a force to be reckoned with. Of course, by this point, Itchy Tom and Riviere Ange were more than strong enough to make our favourite dragon, wizard, elf, twink boy look like Michael Kera next to the Christian Bale Batman of Geese and Hell Hard 8. The release of AL4 did a lot for Shadow Paladin. Navang, Karen, Maha, and Blaster Dark, all really solid cards. Between Maha and Blaster Dark, the deck now suddenly had an insane early game. You could easily hide behind 10k grade 2s, both of which had Vanguard circle effects, meaning you never actually needed to ride up if you were fighting for first stride. The game was only ever a struggle if you were forced to ride Dagda for whatever reason. Meanwhile, Karen was a reliable source of countercharge, and the deck had effectively infinite ways of calling him from the deck, such as Cursed Eye Raven, Naush, Deragda, various strides, and of course, Luard itself. Karen's Soul Blast cost was also easily offset by the fact that you can now easily and readily recycle Vikro. More than that, you didn't even need to start with Vikro anymore, not only because the V starters was just better, but because of Navan. Now, searching Vikro seems like the best use case here, but early on, players unearthed another old card that suddenly became insanely relevant, Bloodmaster. This guy not only provided insane early game pressure and presence, but also plussed you very aggressively. The face down damage was again easily mitigated by the aforementioned Karens and Vikro, and giving yourself that extra damage to play with meant that it was easier to extend with Markers and Blaster Darks during the turns where you actually wanted to start playing the game. Things were looking really good, and there was suddenly a ton of variants on how to build Luard. How hard did you want to commit to Blaster Dark? Did you want to consider splashing in Phantom Blaster Dragons to get force markers? Was it still correct to run some of the old resource heals? How many 10k crits was correct? Find out on the next episode of... wait. Because of the inability to aggressively stack Ritual in the drop zone in the early game due to saturating the deck with new, non-Ritual V-era cards, was Dragfall actually still the right option? Or were we going back to Dragheart and abusing all of this insane plussing and early board advantage we could now build? These are just a small handful of the questions that players like myself and other top Shadow Paladin pilots were asking each other. The sky was almost the limit. I say almost because it's impossible to talk about V-BT12 without talking about another huge problem in the premium metagame, being No Life King. There's actually a whole another documentary from Yellowcard TCG on this channel about No Life King, which you can watch here. It unfortunately does not explain why the card is an apt description for the average League of Legends player, but it does explain how, despite all of this crazy new support, Luard was outshined and was not the best deck in the game at this time. AL4 also introduced V-Alice, which, along with the old Nightmare Doll engine from G, gave rise to what is still to this day one of the most effective finishing combos in the game. So it sounds a lot like the universe conspired against Luard here, or maybe it was all a ruse organised by Big Shadow to keep the eyes of the masses away from how Luard had been good for the last 2.5 years unimpeded. While it was never a deck that you'd see on the podiums of big events, despite lots of people bringing it to tournaments, you did have a lot of cool plays. The deck rewarded a lot of skill, but it just wasn't quite there yet. It was missing that little bit of juice, and whenever it got that little bit of extra juice, everyone else seemed to get even more steroids. So unfortunately, it would only continue to get worse from here. As the calendar turns and we roll into 2019, Ezreal came along with its crazy superior ride and established itself as the high roll deck to rule them all. Meanwhile, Oracle Geese continue to improve thanks to even more OTT generic support. We also got to see what happens when you give Rene a bunch of protect markers and Kokushi Garasu. Spoilers, it was not great. Bermuda also finally got their V support, making Orange Tra even crazier than it already was. And now, every deck finally had a good early game from that V support, meaning that one of Luard's old prime selling points, the ability to grade 2 stall for first stride, was pointless, because decks would just ride up and punish you massively, or go toe-to-toe against you on that grade 2 game. Alternatively, maybe users lost dice roll, couldn't rock business correctly, and they just strode on you anyway. It was almost like the end of G all over again. Luard, the solid deck, the decent pick, losing out to the crazy extra cards of Nubatama and Bermuda and silly timey-wimey gears. In fact, not even a second wave of support could fix things. Gust Blaster was a joke, and the only good card to come out of that set was Swordbreaker, who was only a minor side grade to the other options of the time. Being searchable within the main was cool, but being Soul Blast cost rather than Counter Blast cost made Daylight better. So, while the other half of the game was exploding into V and Premium with high impact, Luard continued to teeter on the precipice, getting Mike Wazowski out of all of the top tables. But it didn't stay that way. Just as the community was at an all-time low about standard Timmies versus premium elitists, and the game looked like it was on the verge of civil war, John Bushiro decided to make everyone suddenly really okay with the whole thing by releasing what was, in hindsight, one of the most awfully designed sets to have ever existed, somehow still being one of the most hyped sets to have ever existed. Premium Collection 2019 was a godsend, we say with bated breath. It was Bushiro making good on their promise that Premium wouldn't be forgotten into the new V-era Premium standard, and it allowed all clans to continue fighting in a world where nothing makes sense, and loops were just a way of life rather than a fruity cereal with a bird mascot. Nearly everyone was excited over the strides their clan got. Nearly. But the power levels were at an all-time high, as was the tension in the air. While we can look back at history with 2020 vision and rose-tinted glasses, and the fact that 3 strides from this set got banned, with Katrina only just recently coming off the ban list, and the 4th continues to be one of the biggest plagues this game has ever seen, the hype realistically was focused entirely elsewhere. Some strides immediately synergized with the decks they were made for to much more than others, such as Dark Lord Princess going nicely into Masquerade Harry, Gastille copying No Life King to enable even more combos, Spear Cross, Spear X enabling Ezel to stride on your grade 2 turn if you accidentally crit them, and Busted giving Nova Grappler the ability to drive check 15 times in one turn. Everything was super cool, and especially of course, Morfessa. In the same way that Busted was just winning champ on steroids, Morfessa was effectively Drag Abyss on crack cocaine.
Like, people were looking at the new Ichikishima, which was crazy, the new Victor support being Bustard, which was crazy, and then finally Morfessa. Because these 3 cards, just at the surface when you read them, read like broken cards. And so people instantly started trying out Morfessa. The fact that you had a guard restrict on top of having a front row buff, on top of draw, on top of critical triggers, like you had everything in one card really. The only issue people started running into pretty quickly was that the Ritual 10 restriction, while it read easy, because everyone thinks it's Ritual, Luard already does this, getting to 10 was quite hard if you didn't get really lucky. The big issue, of course, with the deck was trying to get that Ritual 10 going. Because in terms of grade 2 gaming, people were pretty aware Luard was great at it. Like, the fact that you could go plus 1 billion with Nemain in the early game was really, really good. And so for a while now, it was known this is like a powerful grade 2 game deck. It just didn't really have a payoff for that grade 2 game until Morfessa came out. So now, how do you fix the Ritual 10 issue? Because getting it by second stride is fine and all, but if you are afraid of something like Gusty, DI got a crazy new stride as well, you're afraid of Bustard, which again was going to be a crazy hyped stride, Katrina, Ichikishima, all of these strides try and kill on first stride, or at least get so much advantage on first stride. We want our Morfessa to be live instantly. If you had to put your entire hand into the board just to get stuck on Ritual 9, you basically threw the game. So I started making this really weird system where I started adding values to every single card in my deck. I was like, okay, noise is worth this many cards in terms of advantage, as in how likely is it that if I put this card onto the board, that it will attribute to getting to Ritual 10. And so I don't remember the exact math, but you have to imagine like I need to hit the number 15 in my head, and then maybe Noise is a 5, maybe Nemain is a 2, maybe Belial Owl is a 2, and so forth. And so if I looked at my hand and counted all of these cards, so I have a Noise, that's a 5, Belial is a 2, Nemain is a 2, and so forth. I hit 15, okay, I'm probably, if I start putting my hand onto the board, reach Ritual 10 here. By being able to count that before you start trying, you could at least ensure that you don't put your entire hand into the board and then get stuck, which was the important part. Because technically, if you saw, okay, my hand isn't gonna reach Ritual 10, and then you don't waste it, and you just instead do a slower turn, maybe you just use Morfessa to draw cards, and you kind of use her as a resource card rather than a kill card, then maybe you could survive their stride and try again next turn. And so basically that little extender math, I don't really recall the exact numbers, helped me build a Luard deck that very consistently got Morfessa going, or worst case, you knew I won't get Morfessa going, I'm not even gonna try, I'm just gonna draw a billion cards. So I felt that was kind of like the way to build Luard for that event, or that meta, let's say, and then we ended up winning Springfest Cardiff.
Now, as strong as things were, Luard would still continue to fall by the wayside throughout the rest of the year. While the deck did put up good results here and there, it was largely overshadowed by the likes of Castile, Ezel, and Katrina, a format now often referred to as Premium's Big Three. Fortunately, this time around, he had a lot of good company. Grand Blue, Great Nature, and even Spike Brothers were all contenders for the spot of the 4th Musketeer, and the fact that Luard was a toolbox deck with an explosive finish just like them meant that he too could adjust and adapt to the meta based on what was required.
So Luard kind of fell off because it couldn't quite keep up with the new Ezel stuff. It couldn't quite keep up with some of these other crazy decks that people were playing again. Like NLK got way better with the Brewfast set and so forth. However, there was one interesting new build popping up with Luard, and I think Ryan Kai and his friends kind of popularized it, where they would use Fallen Dive Eagle and then some other grade 1 that I don't quite remember, and they could basically loop Fallen Dive Eagle and Honolly consistently, which made this like a very tanky Luard build. So rather than just turboing to Ritual 10, you would just make it to where your opponent can't really play the game. I mean, they can try, they can attack, just not that often, and you will definitely live for a billion turns, and then eventually you whittle down their resources that way. So this was really like a control Luard style build. I think they called it the tank build, but I don't quite remember. That was a really interesting build. So you had like an Ezel, NLK, Katrina format as the top decks, but then some people were experimenting with like weird Gizeh variants, some people were experimenting with Luard tank build, and so forth.
It wasn't until after the world had become a walking biohazard and everyone was imprisoned inside their homes that the dice finally started rolling in Luard's favour. We had a few restrictions implemented in 2020 that kneecapped 2 of the big 3, with Wonder Ezel and Katrina both exploding in glorious fashion. The 2 fast decks of the big 3 falling apart meant that Luard no longer needed to put a gun to his mouth whenever he lost a dice roll. And with the new support of VEB12 on the horizon, he could even try to go toe-to-toe with Gastiel's late-game combo finish.
The Claret Sword set is where you got a couple new cards, and while initially you wouldn't think that they are Luard support, they ended up buffing Luard a fair bit, and that's because of 2 cards mostly, well 3 if you want to count Branwen. So first you have Branwen, which is your grade 3 searcher, because Luard had this issue where misriding hurts, like you only had a couple grade 3 ride targets, and if you missed them, it was game over. So now suddenly you had Branwen who could look for your grade 3 ride targets, also discard cards, fill your graveyard and so forth, and this is something often overlooked, it also got very big. So while that sounds silly, the fact that Dagda would always call grade 1s, and then those grade 1s would not hit numbers, actually hurt. Like if your Dagda called, for example, 2 Ezras, That's 6k and 6k, making 12k. You add 15 to that, that's 27. That's cute, but that's not great. Whereas if you call two Branwens, that's 13 plus 13 is 26, plus 15, that is 41? Yeah, 41. So suddenly you have like way better numbers thanks to just Branwen alone already. And also, if Branwen was on your board while your Vanguard swung and then you hit stance on that, it was also way more threatening than, you know, some other card that doesn't have 13k base. So Branwen really helped, but then the more important cards, in my opinion, were Blue Espada, Morian Spear, and Dark Pride. All these three cards were basically Claret Sword support, or at least they were meant to be, but rather than being Claret Sword support, I actually started playing them inside Luard. And so at Worlds, that set wasn't legal, it was just out in Japan, not in English. But I was playing it, you know, with the other Worlds players constantly. So we would hang around in Japan, in Akihabara and so forth, and I would just be annihilating friends with like an English Luard deck with just Japanese Blue Espadas and Morian Spears. Because Blue Espada would mill 3, and then after a while, it would also start gaining power. So just like Branwen, you would suddenly have way better numbers. Morian Spear would get garbage out of your hand or even cycle for grade 1s, also improving your grade 2 game, making it a very beefy body as well, which also helped a lot. And then Dark Pride would also mill cards. So some combination of Blue Espada, Morian Spear, and Dark Pride would allow you to have a much better grade 2 game, fill your drop way quicker, and then also kill way better because you had better numbers. So rather than relying on stuff like noise, which, you know, took a while and was hard and you had to do math, and sometimes you wouldn't even hit the numbers, Blue Espada, Morian Spear, Dark Pride, they just instantly set up the whole thing constantly. So thanks to these cards, you could literally do Luard on first try, constantly, consistently, without sacrificing anything, because they just milled. You were basically playing a semi-Grand Blue deck.
Unfortunately, Pride comes before the fall. Later in the year, we would get Premium Collection 2020. By this point, Katrina and Ichishima were dead, Dastile and Morfessa still had targets painted on their backs and foreheads, and a majority of the other strides from Premium Collection 2019 were still the powerhouses that defined how these clans played in Premium. So, everyone looked at Premium Collection 2020 with eager anticipation, ready for either the storm that would bring balance to the Force, I mean Vanguard, or the absolute calamity that would bring the game to its knees. And boy, it did not disappoint.
Ooh, Zazan, you know? Zarzan? Zazan? Zarzan?
Zazan?
Ooh, Zazan.
That sucked ass.
Zazan skill?
Zazan.
Zazan.
Zazen.
Zazan.
Bushiroad! Credit to Bushiroad where it's due, they nipped that bastard demon child in the bud very, very quickly. Unfortunately, that did not put Luard in the clear. Chain Ranker is an insane card, make no mistake, but there's no reason to use it with Luard. Tempest is a funny card, but it too got caught in the crossfire with Zarzan. Not that Luard could really effectively utilize it anyway either. So while you did have cards like Genbald, Bad Bounty, Yvette, Stunverse, and New Adaya ruining the game, Luard continued to remain stagnant, which, as far as Premium goes, is as good as dead. Everyone started to become bigger, better, and faster. Tier 1 in Premium looked like an episode of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and Luard couldn't really do much to keep up. Fortunately for my YouTube watch time and ad revenue metrics, the story does not end here. It's the tail end of 2020, and V-Era has finally entered its own Ferris wheel, and V Luard was no exception. Just when Shadows were first introduced to V, the addition of V Luard and all of its accompanying support blew the field wide open. The options grew literally exponentially. There was no longer a solved Luard list. To this day, there is no solved Luard list. Everything was suddenly equally viable all at once. You could actually do stuff going first and riding up without losing the game, or you had the option of trying to high roll and pretend to be Ezel using Bendy and Phantom Blast the Dragon. You could even splash Morfessa for combo extenders, or you could play it safe and use knees to play a slower, more control-based game. Of course, you still had to juggle the fact that some cards had the word ritual on them and some even looked for that word, but it wasn't nearly as restrictive as, say, Tachikaze needing every card to have the word gauge on it. Old combos resurfaced, new interactions were discovered, and the majority of the Shadow Paladin card pool suddenly became worth considering again. Luard was actually so powerful, it arguably was part of the reason that V Standard began to fall apart. But that's another story for another time.
The way that the game is now is kind of you want to grade 2 game your opponent until you ride up, so that way you can be able to get first ride. Now Luard actually has a actual ride up turn in case he's forced to ride up. So now you can go into your new drag card pool, which is a 13k base, which is kind of hard to beat over, or pretty good going into like a bunch of Excel decks being only like, if they're on an Excel market, only like 12k bodies, you're 13k bodies, so it's like easy. Okay, cool. Have a trigger to hit me or some way to give it power to even poke. On top of that, let's say that you're getting beat up in the early game, you're like, wow, I'm forced to ride up because my grade 2 game isn't as strong. Now you actually can search out your Hanali, which will be able to put your opponent in a bind because you can actually damage choke them, which in this meta, you actually need CB to do a whole lot. So you can keep them at kind of low damage, farm a couple of cards out, get your Hanali out to play like a floodgate-ish type deck. Pass the turn to your opponent after, you draw a check or whatever, and then afterwards, they have to be like, okay, cool, now I have to play into your Hanali now. And then on your follow-up turn, you will have it like a bunch of Luards and Soul already, which is fine. You can go into now your Morfessa stride, getting your crit, give you access to a plethora of things like your 15k front row, your crits as well. And now you kind of have to make a decision in premium on what you value more. Do you value more force markers, or do you value your unstride ability? A couple of key things to kind of highlight between the two is that you're able to generate more free advantage with, of course, your V Luard being able to call a card out of your deck, whereas with the new Luard, you actually don't have the grade 2 game anymore. You can actually just ride up and do things. The reason why I say Luard is soft because you kind of have to make a decision on what you want to play, whether you play V Luard or if you want to play G Luard, and how heavy into the grade 2 game you want to play. Or do you prefer just to ride up with the new introduction of the V Luard, being able to call out cards like Hanali, which helps actually alleviate some of that pressure with these bigger decks, such as like the loop decks, because if they don't have a way to kill your Hanali, hopefully they have enough CB, which again, you can damage deny your opponent and alleviate some of that pressure so that way you can survive their loop turn and you go into your Morfessa turn and you kill them on a crackback. Again, you have to make the decision on if you want to, do you value the ride up plays, or do you want to try and grade 2 game your opponent and pray that they don't hit a bunch of defensive triggers and that you're not forced to ride up yourself, because if you do, if they stride, you pretty much just lose the game.
We are looking at all of this through the lens of Premium after all, and unfortunately, Premium was still very much the field of degenerate explosiveness that we'd all become numb to. Taro combos were still rampant, as was the Blade Master loop, whereas New Adaya would still blow you up, while Gasteel got even faster. This specific meta didn't really have a name to define it until after the hugest ban list in Vanguard history came down. What is now referred to as the Big Six ban list wasn't just revolutionary for its time, we still haven't had anything like it to this day, 2 years later. Much like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, the Renaissance, the moon landing, and COVID, the ban list was a monumental moment for Cardfight Vanguard. Unfortunately for us, this ban list wouldn't come until much, much later, almost an entire year after V Luard was introduced. During this time, all these crazy decks that made Luard not worth thinking about ran rampant, reducing Luard to nothing more than an afterthought for the first few online Bushiroad tournaments, and eventually wiped from people's memories altogether. Even clan selection came and went, doing nothing for Luard, being entirely witch-based support. By the time the clan collections came along with Raging Form and all the Revenger support, Luard's tier number was starting to increase more and more every year. For now, the story ends here, with the game fresh off the heels of a second reboot, this time into Overdress. The advent of Nations brought a lot of feelings. No more Shadow Paladin meant no more direct Luard support outside of more clan or Prem collections. Or did it? But the important thing here is that this also meant for a chance of having new generic effects that Luard could now abuse. Perhaps after a few years of Overdress support, we might see our favorite blonde dragony wizard guy rise to the top once again. Of course, that's nothing to say of any other products or nostalgia bait Bushiroad might lead us down. But that's all another story for another time. Thank you very much to everyone for listening and watching yet another Yellowcard documentary. Hopefully, their final part to Luard's story will be out sooner than later, but I make no promises. Once again, thank you to everyone who supports the channel and watches our content. Feel free to continue to interact and engage with this content however you like, such as leaving a comment, liking and subscribing to the channel, or following us on the other social medias. I've been Zystral with Yellowcard TCG, and we will see you all next time. Take care, peace.